However, there is something I have been asked to talk about, and that is going to be the Bafta situation. People saying, oh, well, why would that even be in his vocabulary? He did that on purpose and all of this stuff, and that racism is to excuse. A very sad day for the Tourette syndrome community, especially for the ones that have coprolalia, because when you come online and you see thousands of people hating on your condition, specifically coprolalia, because that's something that is already very embarrassing for all of us. I'm not going to say that people can't be offended by the fact that somebody said the N-word as a tick. However, it's not something that somebody can control. It's not something that somebody wants to say. And I've been seeing a lot of people be like, well, he said it like when the crowd went silent. That is most likely when a tick is going to happen when you're in public, when you're in complete silence, or when you're trying not to say or do something. So we must understand what coprolalia is. Coprolalia causes involuntary swearing and inappropriate tics. This can include the N-word, slurs, etc. I am a Black person, and even I have the N-word tick and slurs as tics. This is something I don't see many talk about because of situations like this.
There's been a really, really toxic discourse going around the internet over the last day or so, and that is because of the Baftas, where Michael B. Jordan and Delroy Lindo were live on TV, and you could hear someone in the background saying the N-word, and that was John Davidson, who is a man with Tourette, someone who's dedicated a lot of his life to raising awareness for Tourette's in the UK. Loads of people, I know myself, have been educated about Tourette's from the work of this man, and he was there because there's a new film that is nominated for all these awards called I Swear, which documents the early parts of his life. Now, this is a super unfortunate thing to have happened, and I want to talk about it because it's very complex, and I also blame the BBC and the Baftas for even airing this in the first place, when it appears that they actually cut out other people speaking, including someone who said Free Palestine. So they had that opportunity to edit things out and maybe even do some retakes, but they didn't do it. Now, why the discourse has been toxic is it's clear that loads of people involved in this, while maybe coming at it from a good place, don't really understand like anything to do with Tourette's, and they're saying stuff like, well, this guy must have, reacted this way, even if he has Tourette's, because he's actually racist, which I think is completely missing the point, because I don't think he is, but this guy might be racist. He didn't say that on TV in front of a room of loads of celebrities, loads of Black people, because he's some fanatical racist who wanted to actually say this slur to these people, right? That's just not the way it works. But at the same time, I obviously recognize that if you're someone like Michael B. Jordan or Delroy Lindo, someone even telling you that someone said that to you or said that when you were speaking and they have a certain conditions, that's going to be hard to reckon with in your brain, because if you are a Black man in America, it's very, very likely you've been called this in real life by another white person. You've heard this being used by white people forever. It is one of the worst slurs you can say. And you cannot divorce anyone saying that from the history of the word, from your own personal experience of being abused, using that word, from your own experience of your own people in America suffering, being dehumanized with this word. So I totally don't think it's irrational for these two people or anyone in the audience at the time to have a very, very strong reaction that might not be that empathetic. And from my own personal experience, if they're not that forgiving, I totally understand that. But then the problem goes on to wider society, where we weren't in the room. This wasn't our own personal experience of this event. We are moving the discourse onto Tourette's generally. So it's going outside of the event. And now people are saying that, yeah, people with Tourette's, you must segregate them from the public. We cannot have the chance of hearing offensive stuff from people with Tourette's, even though it's not their fault. And we really need to do something about it, which is absolutely bizarre. I think we're having a discourse with what to do about people with Tourette's, when even people with Tourette's is a massive minority of the population. I think I read in the UK it's 300,000. The people with this particular form of Tourette's is a third of that, and it doesn't even manifest in things like saying racial slurs, but it also is a very common thing for a lot of them as well. So it's so insane to take a very unfortunate event where I totally sympathize with the people who like had to hear that, especially in such a public way, and the history of that word and how terrible it is, and then have the BBC actually air it for millions and millions of people to watch. It's disgusting, and I think it shows a massive amount of racism on the BBC's part, and we know that, whether that be anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Muslim racism, or anti-black racism. It's been part and parcel of the BBC for the longest time, and it's only gotten worse. But at the same time, the discourse has to be more empathetic, and if you actually read about John Davidson's life, it's absolutely terrible, like especially when he was younger and developed this. He actually tried to take his own life when he was younger, and that's what the film is dealing with. I just find it so unempathetic. They think this person both wants to do that and isn't absolutely horrified by this. Not that they've gone through this experience their whole life where they don't even want to live on this earth anymore because of what embarrassment and isolation this condition actually causes them. So I want to talk about that all today because yes, I do recognize racism in society and I recognize the history of this word, but the reactionary discourse towards this man and people feeling like we should target this person as some sort of symbol of racism is just so absurd, especially when people with Tourette's and various other neurological or physical disabilities are from the bottom of society, regardless of what that society is, even in regards to race. Like, America was still sterilizing people with disabilities until like the 1970s, right? We've always treated these people as subhuman. And yes, white supremacy, which people from many different ethnic backgrounds and races suffer from, disabled people always suffer from that as well, because white supremacy isn't always just about race. It is combined with what it means to be the dominant racial group. And for white people, that isn't just about being white. And we saw that obviously manifest with the Nazis specifically, but they didn't invent that stuff, right? So I want to talk about all of this today. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm going to outline it. And yeah, this is a very controversial subject. I'm sure there is room for like lots of disagreement with what I'm saying, but I think the overall discourse is it has to come from a place of empathy and realize this person is not in control of saying this. And he's also done a lot of good in the UK context to raise awareness. And I feel like that is also something that's happened in the discourse. There's a massive difference between the UK and US reaction to this. You might say it's because we have different relationships with race. I would say they're quite similar in the 2026 context. But also it's because people like John Davidson have become quite popular on TV shows and documentaries to raise awareness about this. There is a more like cultural awareness of Tourette's in the UK that I don't think there is in America. And I think that is also reflective in how we are talking about these things. But yes, there are British people also talking about maybe we should segregate people with Tourette's from society. So let's get into this. If you guys don't know, let's start with this story. Michael B. Jordan repulsed by Bafta's racial slur while his parents were left in tears. On Sunday night, the American actor presented his first award of the night alongside his Sinners co-star, Delroy Lindo, as the pair prepared to hand out the best visual effects to Avatar. Tourette's campaigner John Davidson was heard shouting the N-word, which prompted gasps across the audience in London's Royal Festival Hall. Following the incident, the BBC removed the entire award ceremony broadcast from iPlayer after facing backlash for not cutting the moment, despite it removing a director's plea to free Palestine elsewhere in the broadcast. Soon after, Lindo told Vanity Fair that he and Jordan did what they had to do while presenting, but he also wished someone from Bafta had spoke to us afterwards. A source has also now told Metro that Jordan, 39, was left repulsed by the outburst. Michael had to do extensive research into the horrific psychological effects of racism to prepare for Sinners, so was disgusted, repulsed, and grossed out by John's outburst. The incident really reminded him of how much work was to be done to drive racism underground. He was having a difficult day already after finding out about an upsetting incident in Atlanta recently, so it just made it worse. After watching the event, the actor's parents were left shaken. His mum and dad broke down in tears when they saw what happened to him and Delroy, and it has been a horrible 48 hours for the family. Davidson issued an apology saying he was mortified if anyone considers my involuntary tics to be intentional or to carry any meaning. And during the ceremony, Bafta host Alan Cumming addressed the outburst, thanking the attendees for their understanding and for helping to create a respectful space for everyone. Davidson could also be heard yelling multiple times throughout the night. He shouted "shut the fuck up" during a speech from Bafta chair Sarah Putt and yelled "fuck you" when Arco's directors took to the stage, as well as several reported shouts of the N-word. So, like I was saying, it's perfectly valid for people like Michael B. Jordan and Delroy Lindo and people present to be really obviously offended by what he said. And I also think even the source saying that, you know, Michael B. Jordan is saying it reminds him how much we have to drive racism underground. I think that also reflects part of the issue, because even if every single person in society was genuinely not a racist and an anti-racist, people like Davidson would still say this stuff because it's not really an issue of racism. And that's the mischaracterization I think is going around. that he said this because he's a racist. It doesn't reflect whether he is a racist or not. As we're going to get into, people do say this with Tourette's. Many people say it, including black people as well. But also, I think there's a fault on the BAFTAs generally. It doesn't appear to be the case, but what I think should have happened, and if there are award ceremonies going forward that John is going to be attending, what they should probably make clear is what this guy might actually be saying. Because it's one thing to tell everyone, we have John Davidson as Tourette's campaigner in attendance because this film about his life is being nominated for all these awards. He might say some stuff which is like very offensive. This includes things that he might have said before, and you could maybe list them. This might include racist language and stuff like that, and maybe explain to the audience better of just why Tourette's causes people to do this. I think if you really educate everyone who is going in and made it very, very clear, like very clear what he could potentially say, I think that would have helped massively, because I doubt they told everyone that he might say something like the N-word. He told someone before the ceremony that he says this and stuff. But yeah, obviously I'm horrified. I can't imagine, like, you know, presenting on stage, especially when you're there for a film that is about like racism in America, and you have that relationship with that word in terms of it's such an offensive thing that you've heard people constantly say throughout your life, likely for both of these people, been called it throughout your life. I'm sure at least one of them has probably spoken about this before. So yeah, it's mortifying, it's horrible, and you can't just suddenly say to people, you should be okay with this word, and hearing this word directed at you because this guy who said it can't help himself and he doesn't mean it. And I think that is important for the discourse, but I'm not here to invalidate how people react to that word, because there's so much stuff tied up in it, including their personal experience, the history of the word, general racism. And like I said, I wouldn't say it's a reminder to people that racism needs to be driven out because this guy can't help himself, but the word obviously conjures up like all of that sentiment and stuff. But now I just want to quickly shift to John Davidson's like life a bit before we talk about the rest of it. So there was an article by the Telegraph that came out in October where they just interviewed him. The man behind I Swear, I Have Tourette's, I yelled fuck the Queen when I met her. So it just talks about his struggle that is depicted in the film from an early age. So talking about trying to take his own life because of his Tourette's, I was in the depths of despair. By then, he had the enduring symptoms of Tourette's for 2 years, since a caravan holiday in Skegness with his mother and 3 siblings. It had been ruined, and out of nowhere, adolescent John began saying cunt. It was to the extent I was running out of breath. It was quite a shock for my mum. It's not the nicest of word, especially around females. Even as a 12-year-old, I knew that. Back home a couple weeks later, his mother sent him to his room after he'd been messing around in the bathroom. She said, think about what you've done. And lying in bed, I don't know why, at the top of my voice I shouted, suck my cock. In response, my mum gave me a good thump and said, I'm not having this. First of those life chronicling documentaries was bluntly titled John's Not Mad. In a 1989 documentary, his puzzling behaviour was finally diagnosed, but we see the toll as it opens with a close-up of a clearly shattered 16-year-old talking freely of suicidal ideation. We also see the devastation of John's family. At dinner with his siblings, dessert sits in the middle of the table under a plastic box to protect it from his spitting. On screen in I Swear, we learnt that John's father left the family home when he was a teenager, and John said his dad couldn't cope with his behaviour. I just felt like my family didn't want me around. He's learnt to manage his tics and language with years of powerful antipsychotic drugs and therapy, and he explains that talking freely, as we do now, helps him. He goes on, recalling the night he walked into the Tweed, telling me that his Tourette's had left him isolated and in and out of home. In trouble with his mum after bunking off to go fishing, he went back to the river, a peaceful place where he experienced no tics. I got to a stage in my life where I'd had enough. I was tired and I thought, I wonder if it would be a quick death if I just go into the water and let the current just take me. He pauses, which is not something he does often, not understanding what I was doing really, but someone spotted me floating in the water, phoned the fire brigade and the police, who came and dragged me out. Then it was the ambulance to the hospital. That's where people started to sit up and think this is serious. Davidson knows better than anyone you can't keep Tourette's wholly at bay. So when he met the Queen, he introduced him with, and for the services to the people with Tourette syndrome, John Davidson, and he said, fuck the Queen at the top of my voice. Thinking back, he says he can see some of the guys in the military orchestra trying to play their instruments without pissing themselves, but mercifully the Queen was unfazed. She said, congratulations, Mr. Davidson. Then I started to relax because she said, I believe you've done lots of television appearances trying to improve people's knowledge of Tourette's. Yes, ma'am, I've done 5 documentaries. For Davidson, that was a eureka moment, he adds. I was thinking to myself, if the Queen of England can accept my Tourette's and be in my company, why the fuck should I have to do all this awareness raising? Why can't ordinary people just accept it the same way? So I thought it was important just to highlight to people like what this guy has gone through in his life. Coprolalia is the term for what he does in his Tourette's, all these things he says, like, you know, he's meeting the Queen of England. To loads of people, that is like one of the biggest honors you can have, and he says fuck the Queen to her face, right? So it's obviously, you know, as terrible as what he said at the Baftas is, it's pretty clear this is the pattern that people who suffer from this condition have, no matter what the context. And to think that this guy is sinister and he just wants to get into these places to express himself like that to the Queen or at the, you know, the Baftas and stuff, is just not really understanding what he's even going through. And like he said, he had a terrible family life because of it. It put such stress on his family. His dad left the family. He tried to take his own life because he couldn't stand it anymore. And he's done a remarkable thing. He's turned his life into something super positive, where so many people in the UK context now understand this far better because of him. But now, because he said something and his Tourette's has manifested in something that has been like super offensive to people, people are using him as some sort of punching bag, as a part of a horrible discourse about how we should ostracize these people forever and not allow them to be part of society, because we'd rather put these people away like we have always done. We've always ostracized these people rather than educate ourselves and educate society and help people understand why people like this do what they do. And yeah, and like I said, you can be sympathetic to people hearing this stuff, but what they have to do is not preventative measures of let's gag this person, let's not allow them in the door, which is actually, I think, illegal under the Equality Act in the UK. The solution should be better education around Tourette's, better education that this guy did not say these things because he's a racist. We understand, and medically we understand, that these people say these things for a certain reason, so we don't need a discourse about how do we prevent these people from existing in society when it's such a very specific example. People who suffer from his specific condition are a minority of a tiny, tiny minority. So the discourse around this, I think, is so disingenuous. And I want to shift this discourse now to some Black Americans I've seen talking about this who actually have this same form of Tourette's, and they've been talking about it. And the first one is going to be from a creator called Shayla Amamiya on Instagram, and she just talks about it.
And I've been seeing a lot of people be like, well, he said it like when the crowd went silent. That is most likely when a tic is going to happen when you're in public, when you're in complete silence, or when you're trying not to say or do something. So we must understand what coprolalia is. Coprolalia causes involuntary swearing and inappropriate tics. This can include the N-word, slurs, etc. I am a Black person, and even I have the N-word tic and slurs as tics. This is something I don't see many talk about because of situations like this. Is it a disappointing thing? Shut up! That it happened in public in front of that entire crowd, specifically to Michael B. Jordan and the other presenter. I'm so sorry, I do not know his name. I wish I did, but no disrespect to him. I just am not too aware. Yes, it is a very unfortunate situation. Seeing so many people say that they would invoke violence against people with coprolalia if they can't control their tics. That's ableism. The fucked up thing that this happens, yes, but it's something that we can't control. Aggression in the brain being triggered. Shut up. And ultimately causing inappropriate tics. Michael B. Jordan and the other presenter have the right to be upset, especially if they were not aware. However, we need to understand and educate ourselves. And on my videos, I constantly see people saying, oh my god, so funny, if I had cursing tics, I would be laughing all the time. But when people actually have cursing tics, then it's offensive and they're a bad person and this and that, the third. We need to do better. We need to educate ourselves better. This is not me saying that people don't have the right to be offended. However, you can't be offended when a disabled person is disabled. I am seeing a ton of people saying, oh my god, during Black History Month, Tourette syndrome is not based on a month. Offensive tics are gonna happen no matter what shut up a person does. I'm Black. Oh my goodness. And I also have the N-word as a tic. I have other slurs as tics. Does this mean that I use them regularly? Does this mean that I mean them? Does this mean that I can control what I say? No, it does not. That's not how coprolalia works. That is not how Tourette syndrome works. Quite literally the Sweet Anita situation all over again. Shut up. Where she ended up saying the N-word on stream. She got canceled for it, got called racist, etc. We need to do better. I've seen so many people say, that we can control our tics. That's not, if you can control a tic, it's not a tic. Let me explain what a tic is in detail. Shut up, bitch. A tic is when your neurons misfire. You think that you can seriously fucking control a neuron misfiring. I've never seen a human possibly do that. We have got to stop thinking with our feelings and start thinking with logic. It is okay to be offended. shut up. But what it is not okay to do is be ableist and try to make it seem like people with Tourette's, specifically those with coprolalia, say their tics on purpose. My whole think piece on this, if you are offended, I do deeply apologize, but I'm just being logical here. I see a lot of people giving their think pieces, and they are specifically talking about racism when tics don't correlate with racism. But that's not what causes offensive or obscene tics. What causes those kinds of tics are coprolalia. Coprolalia, shut up, is completely involuntary and does not involve your vocabulary.
She outlined it perfectly. As someone who experiences the exact same thing, you can't like logic your way out of someone having a tic that says a racial slur, right? You ostracize people with disabilities and things like Tourette's because they make you uncomfortable, no matter how uncomfortable they make you. Do you do that, or do you educate everyone and, of course, combat racism every day and educate people about racism to create a society that is both equal in terms of racially, but also in terms of people who aren't the majority, which includes people with Tourette's? And like I was saying, and like Shayla said there, even if you solved racism and everyone was an anti-racist, people who have this condition would still say that stuff. So what do you want these people to do? So, I mean, like, what do you think the solution actually is? Like, these people can't go to award shows. They have to wear muzzles. It's a stupid discourse, because all the attention shouldn't be focused on John Davidson. It should be focused on the Baftas. And let's get onto that now. So the Baftas decided to air this part of the show, and the show is recorded 2 hours in advance, and they actually edited out other parts of the show. So as part of Akinola Davis Jr.'s winning speech, he says, "For Nigeria, for London, the Congo, free Palestine." They cut that out because the BBC is a pro-Zionist organisation, and in their minds, they're being racially sensitive in that they think, well, Jewish people, in our view, and Zionists will find this anti-Semitic, that this person has said free Palestine. So let's censor the black artist saying free Palestine, but let's not actually edit the white guy saying the N-word when 2 black presenters are on screen. And Bob Villan summed it up perfectly, so I'm just going to play the video he put on his Twitter.
But why then is it that the shouting of a racial slur by a white man with Tourette syndrome whilst 2 black actors, Michael B. Jordan and Delroy Lindo, were on stage presenting an award, managed to make the final TV edit, whilst Akinola Davies Jr., a black director accepting an award later that night, had his statement of free Palestine cut from the final TV edit. A statement that is not racially insensitive or discriminatory and is actually a very mild humanitarian call for freedom. Now, I'm aware of the symptoms of Tourette syndrome, so what I'm really concerned with is not the actions of a man with a very complicated neurological condition, but the decision by a broadcasting company embroiled in scandals to leave that racial slur in the final edit, but remove a call for freedom, which means even after all of their preemptive planning for censorship, a decision was made to leave one and remove the other. Now, could it be that they left it in with the desire to highlight the complex nature and reality of living with Tourette syndrome in daily life? Doubtful. Could it be another BBC blunder? Could it be that black people are just fair game to the BBC? Always. But could it be something far more sinister? Could it be that the BBC is not really concerned with censorship at all unless it threatens the image of Israel? One of the key board members of the BBC, Robbie Gibb, has not only acted as an editorial advisor for the right-wing news outlet GB News, but in 2020 led a consortium to buy the Jewish Chronicle, a newspaper that continuously protects the actions of the Israeli state, war crimes and all. A man that you will remember survived calls for his removal from the board in 2025 after more than 400 media figures signed a letter to the BBC urging them to remove him over impartiality concerns following the BBC's decision not to air the documentary Gaza, Doctors Under Attack. We can be quite confident that no heads will roll. It will be highly unlikely that we will see anybody lose their job over this. Nobody will be forced to step down. Multiple statements and apologies will not continue to be issued over the course of months, and no inquiry will take place as to how this could have happened.
So I think that sums it up like perfectly. The BBC left something in because it's actually racist, and it took something out because it's actually in bed with the Israel lobby and doesn't want to offend Zionists. That's pretty much racism in the UK right now. And there's this discourse that I forgot what guy started it. He sings that Football's Coming Home song. He wrote a book basically saying that racism against Jewish people is like totally tolerated and accepted in British society, which is absolute bullshit. But racism against black people is absolutely justified, tolerated, and at all levels of the British press and government. And I think this Baftas event is pretty much proof of that. Of like, they have editorial oversight. It wasn't live. They could have taken stuff out, like John Davidson saying the N-word while two black presenters were presenting. Didn't do that, but they made sure to take Free Palestine out of the mouth of another black director in the same broadcast. And that was an editorial decision. Now, something interesting I also saw going around on Twitter today was from an old documentary which showed a black British woman with Tourette's, and she was being racist to South Asians in a supermarket. And she was saying, I say this stuff to everyone. Like, it doesn't matter what background you're from. Like, I will probably say something offensive to you about your background. And I just hope this whole discourse, if there's a silver lining, it's not that every single person like goes after John Davidson for the rest of his life for something he can't control. It's that there is a better understanding about Tourette's. And the fight against racism in the UK, for example, is not against John Davidson, it's against the BBC. It's not against people with Tourette's, it's against the British government. The same way in America, the fight against racism is not against people with Tourette's who involuntarily say something like that. It's against the US government. And like I've been saying, it doesn't matter how much racism goes away if people have involuntary tics like this. Unless you eradicate these words completely from the English language and no one ever says them, these people will keep saying them because it is not motivated by racism. It doesn't matter if they're racist or if they're not racist. These tics aren't a reflection of their personal morality around these things. So I just hope the discourse has a bit more empathy. And like I said, I totally understand the horror of hearing those words at such a public event, having everyone in the world watch it and not actually understanding even the context. And even if you do understand the context, you can't tell someone to like logic their way out of that emotion with a word that is tied up in so many like centuries of like white supremacy, brutality, killings and stuff like that. You just can't do that. And you can't tell these people if they feel a certain way about John Davidson, you must forgive him, you must, be his best mate, you must totally understand. I understand. It's an emotional reaction to some word that is designed to conjure up like such an emotional response because of what its association is and its history and stuff like that. At the same time, the discourse around like ostracizing these people, it's actually illegal to refuse this guy entry to the awards based on this justification. Like, you actually can't do that. So the fact that people are going like full Hitler about disabled people and people with Tourette's because of this just shows that there isn't a good understanding and how close society really is to actually treating these people like we have done in the past. And there is a terrible discourse at the moment in the UK that people are overdiagnosed with like ADHD and OCD, things that we've only recently started understanding better. As someone with OCD myself, I didn't even realize I had it until like 3 years ago because we just don't have an honest discussion about it. And just what I also saw as a final point, people think OCD is like Leonardo DiCaprio in The Aviator playing Howard Hughes. That's like the popular stereotype of OCD. Everyone is like just obsessed with cleanliness. And it's the same with Tourette's being influenced in the American context by like South Park, in contrast in the British context being influenced by John Davidson. People's perception of things like OCD and Tourette's is influenced often by popular media. And that's why our understanding is often so poor about them. Like, if I tell someone I have OCD, I don't think they'd ever actually, on first hearing that, realize what I go through with it, because it's nothing like Howard Hughes in The Aviator or Howard Hughes in real life. It's really complex and different for every different person. And the only thing I would say, having something like OCD makes you more empathetic for people with Tourette's, is one symptom of OCD is really bad intrusive thoughts. And when you're younger, especially, and you have these intrusive thoughts, they could be violent, they could be sexual, they could be about, self-harm, they could be about a whole host of like terrible shit. When you're younger, you don't understand it. You are so isolated by it because you're like, I can't tell someone what goes through my head sometimes in the most uncomfortable situations. Like, I'll be just about to fall asleep, bam, terrible thought. I'll be standing on a balcony, terrible thought. I'll be driving my car, terrible thought. And you can't articulate it to people because we don't have that understanding. So if I tell people someone, they're like, oh, so you're crazy then, you're crazy. And it gets better the more like you regulate yourself or do things that make your OCD like lesser, but it's not understood. So if I wanted to have a conversation with someone who has no history of this in their family or personally, and it's just based on their own understanding from media, how are we even going to have a productive discussion? They're never going to understand it, and they're going to come away from that conversation, even if they pretend to understand, just probably thinking lesser of me, because that's what we think in society. If you have these things, if they're involuntary, like these intrusive thoughts I have aren't a reflection of me, and that's why it's so hard to deal with them, because it makes you doubt it. When you don't know you have these things like OCD, you're like, am I just really fucked in the head? And then you realize as you get older, thankfully for someone like myself, I'm like, no, it's this condition that if I live a life that makes it worse, these things get way worse. And happily, because I know I have it now, these things have massively gone away for the most part. So that's a good thing. But again, we have to have that conversation rather than stigmatizing people who have these conditions. And like in the UK discourse, talk about how, oh, like all the doctors say everyone has ADHD, autism, and OCD, therefore it's fake and people are lazy or some shit, right? So I just think it's just more an understanding of these conditions generally and how involuntary they are and how the people who suffer them have so much isolation and they don't want to do these things if it's not obvious. Do you think he wanted to say that to the Queen and he wanted to say that at the Baftas? So that was it for the video. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.